I never thought my life would unravel in the span of 14 hours. That's all it took. 14 hours to lose everything I'd spent 2 decades building. My career, my marriage, my children, my identity. Everything I thought was solid ground turned out to be sand, and I watched it all slip through my fingers while I stood there, paralyzed, unable to do a damn thing about it. If you're watching this from somewhere right now, and I hope you'll drop a comment and tell me where, I want you to know something. This story isn't just mine. It's for anyone who's ever felt like they were standing on top of the world one moment and buried beneath it the next. If that's you, if you've ever had everything collapse in what felt like a single breath, then maybe you'll understand why I'm telling this. And if you haven't experienced it yet, well, stick around. Because the lesson I learned that day and in the days that followed might just save you from the same fall. Before we go any further, do me a favor. If you feel something in these words, if the story starts to grip you the way it still grips me, hit that subscribe button. Check the description box below for more stories like this. Real stories, raw stories. The kind that don't get told at dinner parties. And maybe, just maybe, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because we all need to know we're not alone when everything falls apart. It started on a Tuesday morning in October. The air had that crisp bite to it, the kind that makes you feel alive when you step outside. I remember thinking it was going to be a good day. I'd had my coffee, kissed Sarah on the cheek before she left for her shift at the hospital, and watched the kids pile into the car for school. Emma, my oldest at 15, rolled her eyes when I waved. Jacob, 12, pretended not to see me. Normal teenage stuff. Normal life. I drove to the office in North Haven with the radio on, some classic rock station, playing Tom Petty. I'd been with Caldwell and Associates for 18 years. 18 years of 60-hour weeks, missed soccer games, postponed vacations, all for what I thought was security. I was a senior project manager, the guy they call when things went sideways, the one who could talk clients off ledges and bring projects in under budget. I wasn't just good at my job. I was damn good at it. The office was on the 7th floor of a glass building that overlooked the harbor. I had a window seat, which in corporate America meant I'd arrived. My desk was organized, my calendar color-coded, my performance reviews immaculate. I thought I was untouchable. I was wrong. At 10:30, Janet from HR called my extension. Could I come down to the conference room? There was something they needed to discuss. The words were pleasant enough, but there was something in her voice, a flatness, a careful neutrality, that made my stomach tighten. The conference room was on the 3rd floor. It had no windows, just beige walls and a long table that could seat 20, but currently held only 3 people. Janet, my direct supervisor, Paul, who wouldn't meet my eyes, and Gregory Caldwell himself, the founder, a man I'd spoken to maybe 5 times in 18 years. They didn't waste time. The company was restructuring. My entire department was being eliminated. Budget cuts. Market conditions. Nothing personal. They were offering a severance package, 3-month salary, continuation of health insurance for 90 days, and a letter of recommendation. The words came at me like bullets, each one finding its mark. I sat there trying to process what I was hearing. 18 years. Not 18 months or 18 weeks. 18 years of my life, and they were ending it with manila folder and 3 months' pay. I asked about my projects. Paul finally looked at me then, and I saw something in his expression that made everything worse. Pity. He pitied me. They'd already reassigned everything. My clients had been contacted. My files had been transferred. It was done. It had all been done before they even called me into that room. I was escorted back to my desk by building security, a kid named Tyler who used to chat with me about basketball in the elevator. He stood there while I packed my personal items into a cardboard box. 18 years fit into one box. Family photos. A coffee mug Emma had made me in 3rd grade. A plaque from a project 3 years ago. My degree from a wall. That was it. That was all I had to show for nearly 2 decades. The walk to the parking lot felt like a death march. People I'd worked with for years suddenly found reasons to look at their computers, to duck into offices, to be anywhere but in my path. Nobody wanted to catch whatever failure I had. Nobody wanted to be reminded that it could happen to them too. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could turn the key. I couldn't go home yet. Couldn't face walking through that door in the middle of a work day with a box of my things. So I drove through neighborhoods I didn't recognize, past parks and schools and shopping centers, trying to figure out how I was going to tell Sarah. We'd been married for 17 years. High school sweethearts who'd made it past the statistics. She'd put me through college while working as a receptionist, then put herself through nursing school. Once I'd landed the job at Caldwell, we were supposed to be a team. We were supposed to be building something together. But somewhere along the way, in between the mortgage payments and the parent-teacher conferences and the endless cycle of work and sleep and work again, we'd stopped being a team. We'd become two people living in the same house, managing the same children, going through the same motions. When was the last time we'd actually talked? Really talked? Not just coordinated schedules and discussed bills? I couldn't remember. I finally went home around 4. The house was in a subdivision called Meadowbrook, one of those planned communities where every house looks almost identical except the color of the shutters. Ours were blue. Sarah had picked blue. Her car was in the driveway. She wasn't supposed to be home until 7. I walked in carrying my box, and she was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine in front of her. It wasn't even 4:30, and she was drinking wine. That should have been my first clue. But I was still stuck in my own disaster, still trying to figure out how to tell her I'd been fired. I didn't have to tell her. She already knew. Paul's wife and Sarah worked at the same hospital. The news had traveled fast. What she said next, I'll never forget. Not the words themselves, though those cut deep enough, but the way she said them. Flat, decided, like she'd been rehearsing. She was done. She'd been done for a while, but she'd been waiting. Waiting for what? I asked. Waiting for the kids to be older, she said. Waiting for me to notice we were drowning. Waiting for me to care more about our marriage than I cared about that job. And now that the job was gone, there was no reason to wait anymore. I stood there with my box of office things, trying to process the fact that I was losing everything in a single day. She'd already talked to a lawyer. She'd already found an apartment. She was taking the kids, at least temporarily. They needed stability, she said, and I couldn't provide that right now. Not with no job. Not with whatever breakdown I was clearly heading toward. The kids. God, the kids. They came home from school at 5. Emma took one look at both of us and knew. Jacob tried to pretend everything was normal, talking about his history test, but his voice was too bright, too forced. They packed bags. Essentials, Sarah called them, like they were going on vacation instead of leaving their father. By 6 o'clock, they were gone. By 7, I was alone in a house that suddenly felt cavernous. The silence was suffocating. I walked from room to room, seeing evidence of the life we built everywhere I looked. Photos on the walls. Jacob's baseball trophies on the shelf. Emma's debate team ribbons on the refrigerator. All of it was still there. But the people were gone, and I couldn't stay there. Not in that house. Not with those empty rooms echoing with everything I'd lost. I drove without thinking, no destination in mind, just needing to move, needing to be somewhere other than that empty house with its accusatory silence. The gas tank was nearly empty, and my stomach was a hollow pit I hadn't noticed until I saw the sign for Murphy's Diner off Route 9. It was one of those old-school places that looked like it had been there since the 50s, all chrome and neon and worn vinyl booths. The kind of place that served breakfast all day and kept the coffee coming without asking. The parking lot was mostly empty. It was just after 8 on a Tuesday night, that dead zone between dinner and late-night cravings. I sat in my car for a moment, staring at the glowing open sign, wondering what the hell I was doing. What was I supposed to do now? Eat a burger and pretend my life hadn't just imploded? Go back to an empty house and stare at the walls? Start sending out resumes to companies that would see my age and my salary history and find someone younger and cheaper? If you've ever lost everything in a single day, you know this feeling, this paralysis, this sense that the world has kept spinning, but you've somehow fallen off, and you're just floating in space, watching everyone else go about their normal lives while yours is turned to ash. Drop a comment, if you know what I'm talking about. Tell me I'm not crazy for feeling this way. I finally went inside. The place smelled like coffee and grease and something baking, maybe pie. There were maybe 6 other people scattered across the booths, all of them absorbed in their own worlds. Phones, newspapers, quiet conversations. Nobody looked up when I walked in. I took a booth in the back, near the window. A waitress who looked about my age came over with a menu and a tired smile. Her name tag said Diane. I ordered coffee and a cheeseburger, not because I was hungry, but because it seemed like the thing to do. She nodded and walked away, and I was alone again with my thoughts. That's when everything changed. An old man shuffled in through the door. He had to be in his late 70s, maybe early 80s. Thin white hair, stooped shoulders, wearing a jacket that had seen better decades. He moved slowly, like each step took effort, and when Diane tried to seat him at a booth near the front, he waved her off and kept walking, straight toward me. I didn't think anything of it at first. Maybe he was going to the restroom in the back. But then he stopped at my booth, just stopped and stood there, staring at me with these watery blue eyes that seemed to be looking through me rather than at me. I thought maybe he was confused. Maybe he thought I was someone else. I was about to say something when he spoke. His voice was rough, scratched by time and cigarettes. He said, "You look exactly like my boy." I didn't know what to say to that. I just stared at him, this stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere, and was now standing at my table making impossible claims. He didn't wait for me to respond. He gestured at the empty seat across from me. "Can I sit?" he asked. It wasn't really a question. He was already sliding into booth before I could answer. Up close, I could see the lines carved deep into his face, the age spots on his hands, the slight tremor in his fingers. But his eyes were sharp, focused, fixed on me like I was the answer to a question he'd been asking for years. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to be polite. "I think you got me confused with someone else." He shook his head slowly. No confusion. I know my own son's face. Even after all these years, I'd know it anywhere. And you've got it. Same eyes, same jaw, same way of holding yourself, like you're carrying weight nobody else can see. That last part hit harder than it should have, because that's exactly how I felt. Like I've been carrying an invisible weight for so long that I've forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. "Your son," I said carefully. "Where is he now?" The old man's face did something complicated. Pain and grief and something else I couldn't name. Gone. Disappeared 47 years ago. He was 23. Had his whole life ahead of him. And then one day he just wasn't there anymore. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. Losing a child, even an adult child, had to be the worst kind of hell. But I still don't understand what that has to do with me. Diane brought my coffee, and the old man ordered his own, black with 2 sugars. We sat in silence while she poured and walked away. The old man dumped the sugar packets into his cup, stirred slowly, took a sip. Then he looked at me again with those sharp blue eyes. "My name is Harold Brennan," he said. "My son's name was David James Brennan. He disappeared in August of 1977. One day he was working at the factory, living in his apartment on Elm Street, planning to propose to his girlfriend. The next day, he was gone. No note, no phone call, no body, just gone." I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup, not sure where this was going or why this man had chosen me to tell his story to. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe he told this story to anyone who would listen. Maybe I just had one of those faces. The police looked for him. Harold continued, filed a missing person report, interviewed his friends, his girlfriend, his co-workers. Nothing. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. His girlfriend, Beth, she waited for him, kept thinking he'd come back, that there was some explanation. She waited for 2 years before she finally moved on, married someone else, had a family. He paused, took another sip of coffee. His hands were steadier now, like telling the story had given him purpose. For years, I looked for him, hired a private investigator, put ads in newspapers across the country. Nothing. Eventually, most people assumed he was dead. Missing that long, the odds aren't good. But I never believed it. A father knows. And I knew my boy was out there somewhere. I just couldn't find him. I'm sorry for your loss, I said again, but I'm really not sure why you're telling me this. Harold leaned forward, and his voice dropped lower, because 3 days ago I got a letter, first piece of mail, about David I've gotten in 47 years. It was from a lawyer in Boston. Seems David had a will, had it drawn up years ago, but with instructions that it not be executed until after his death. He died 6 months ago. Heart attack. Lived his whole life in Boston under a different name. The diner felt suddenly colder. I didn't understand why the stranger's story was affecting me so deeply, but there was something in the way he was looking at me, something in the careful way he was choosing his words. The lawyer sent me some of David's effects. Harold continued. Photos, letters he'd never sent, and a confession of sorts. Turns out David left because he'd gotten involved in something bad. Some kind of scheme at the factory. Embezzlement. He was young and stupid and thought he could make quick money. When it all started to unravel, he panicked. Thought he'd go to prison. Thought he'd destroy our family's name. So he ran. Jesus, I said softly. He built a whole new life in Boston. Different name, different identity. He worked construction, married a woman, had a son, lived quiet, never came back because he was too ashamed, because he thought we were better off thinking he was dead than knowing he was a coward who'd run away. Harold's voice cracked on that last word. He took a moment, cleared his throat, sipped his coffee. My food arrived. The cheeseburger looked good, but I couldn't imagine eating it now. I just sat there, waiting for Harold to continue, knowing somehow that he wasn't done, that there was more coming, and it was going to change everything. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a photograph. Old, bent at the corners, colors faded. He slid it across the table toward me. This is David, he said. This was taken about 6 months before he disappeared. I looked at the photo. The man in it was young, early 20s, with dark hair and a slight smile. And Harold was right. The resemblance was there. Not exact, but enough to notice. Same general build. Similar features. But it was a second photo that made my blood run cold. Harold slid another one across. This one was newer, though still dated. It showed an older man, maybe in his 60s, standing in front of what looked like a construction site. Same eyes as the first photo. Older, weathered, but unmistakably the same person. This was taken about 10 years before he died. Harold said. The lawyer sent it. I stared at the photo, my mind racing. There was something familiar about the man, something I couldn't quite place, but that was triggering alarm bells in my head. The thing is, Harold said, and now his voice was different. Harder, more certain. David had a son. My grandson. A boy I never got to meet. A boy who would be about your age now. Mid-40s. The lawyer wouldn't give me details. Said there were privacy concerns. But he mentioned that the son had been adopted. That David's wife had died when the boy was young, and the child had gone into the foster system. I set the photo down carefully. My hand was shaking. No, I said. No, that's not possible. What's your name, son? I told him. Robert Hensley. Bob to most people. And were you adopted? The question hung in the air between us. The diner felt like it was shrinking, the sounds around us fading to a dull buzz. Yes, I said finally. When I was 7, my mother died, and I didn't have any other family. Or at least, that's what they told me. Harold nodded slowly, like I had just confirmed something he already knew. The record said David's son was placed with a family in Connecticut, that the adoption was finalized when the boy was 7 years old. This is insane, I said. You can't just show up and claim we're related based on some photos, and a story about a son your missing son supposedly had. This is crazy. Maybe it is, Harold said, but humor an old man. Tell me about your childhood. What do you remember from before you were 7? And that's when the walls started to close in, because the truth was, I didn't remember much. Flashes of images, a small apartment, a woman's voice singing, moving a lot, being scared, then foster care, then the Hensleys, who'd given me their name and raised me like their own. I'd never questioned it. Never dug into my history. The Hensleys had been good to me, and I'd been grateful to have a family at all. But now, with this old man sitting across from me showing me photos of a stranger who looked like someone I might have seen in a mirror 30 years from now. Questions that I'd never thought to ask began flooding my mind. I didn't sleep that night. After Harold left the diner, after pressing a business card into my hand, and making me promise to call him, after sharing one more detail that I couldn't shake, I sat in that booth for another hour, staring at nothing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The detail was this. David had kept a safety deposit box in Boston. In it were documents, more photos, and a letter addressed to my son if he ever wants to know. The lawyer had the key and instructions to release the contents to any legitimate heir who could prove their identity. Legitimate heir. As if identity was something you could prove with a blood test and a birth certificate. As if 40-plus years of being Robert Hensley could be erased by a DNA swab and some old photographs. I drove home in a fog. The empty house was exactly as I'd left it, but it felt different now. Everything felt different. I walked through rooms I'd lived in for years, and suddenly they seemed like stage sets, props in someone else's life. Who was I? Robert Hensley, the man who just lost his job and his family in a single day? Or was I someone else entirely, someone with a whole history I'd never known existed? The rational part of my brain said this was crazy. Harold was a grief-stricken old man looking for closure, and I just happened to have a passing resemblance to his long-lost son. Coincidence. Wishful thinking. Nothing more. But there was another part of me, a part one didn't want to acknowledge, that felt something shift when Harold had shown me those photos. Recognition. Not of the faces and the pictures, but of something deeper, like a puzzle piece clicking into place in a part of my mind I'd never known was incomplete. I spent the night in my home office, the one room Sarah had never cared much about because it was too cluttered with my old files and books and projects I'd meant to finish someday. I pulled out the box I kept in the back of the closet, the one with my adoption papers, and the few documents I had from before the Hensleys took me in. There wasn't much. A birth certificate that listed my mother as Catherine Brennan. Father unknown. I'd been born in Boston. My mother had died in a car accident when I was 6, and I'd spent a year in foster care before being adopted. That was the story I'd always known. Catherine and Brennan. Brennan. Harold's last name was Brennan. I grabbed my laptop and started searching. Catherine Brennan, Boston, 1970s. I got hundreds of results, none of them obviously relevant. I tried different combinations. David Brennan, Boston. David Brennan, disappeared in 1977. David Brennan factory embezzlement. And there it was, buried in old newspaper archives that had been digitized, a small article from the Hartford Courant dated September 1977. Local man sought in factory theft. The article mentioned David J. Brennan, age 23, who was wanted for questioning regarding missing funds from his employer. The article was brief, just a few paragraphs, and there was no follow-up, no arrest, no resolution. Just a young man who become a question mark and then been forgotten. I kept digging. Found David's obituary from 6 months ago in a Boston paper. He died as David Morrison, age 70, survived by no immediate family. Services had been private. There was no mention of a wife or children. No mention of a life before David Morrison. Just a quiet death notice for a man who'd erased his past and built something new. But if David Morrison was really David Brennan, and if he'd had a son, and if that son had been put up for adoption after his mother died, then the timeline fit. The details fit. Everything fit except the one thing I couldn't quite make myself believe, that I could have lived 43 years without knowing who I really was. I need to tell you something that I haven't fully admitted yet, even to myself. As I sat there in that office, surrounded by evidence that my entire identity might be built on incomplete information, part of me felt relief. Not happiness. I'd lost too much in the past 24 hours to feel happy about anything. But relief. Because if I wasn't really Robert Hensley, if that identity was something that had been given to me rather than something I'd been born into, then maybe Robert Hensley's failures weren't entirely my own. Maybe the man who'd lost his job and his wife and his kids was just a character I'd been playing, and underneath it all was someone else. Someone who might have a chance to start over. It's a seductive thought, isn't it? The idea that you could shed your failures like an old skin and emerge as someone new, I know it's irrational. I know that's not how identity works. But I also know that in that moment, sitting in my office at 3 in the morning, I wanted to believe it more than I'd wanted to believe anything in my life. By sunrise, I'd made a decision. I was going to meet Harold again. I was going to go to Boston and see what was in that safety deposit box. And if there was even a chance that I was David Brennan's son, I was going to find out the truth, not just for Harold, not even just for myself, but for the kids, for Emma and Jacob, who deserved to know their full history, who deserved to know that their father hadn't just materialized out of nowhere, a blank slate with no past. They had roots. Maybe they weren't the roots I'd thought we had, but they were something real, something concrete, something that went back further than the Hensleys and their suburban Connecticut life. I called Harold at 8 in the morning. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the early hour. He'd been expecting my call. We made plans to meet the next day and drive to Boston together. He'd already contacted the lawyer and arranged for us to access the safety deposit box. The next 36 hours were some of the strangest of my life. I had calls to make, obligations to handle. I needed to file for unemployment. I needed to respond to the separation papers Sarah's lawyer had sent over. I needed to figure out what I was doing with my life. But all I could think about was Boston, about a safety deposit box that might contain the key to everything, about a grandfather I'd never known existed, and a father who died without ever trying to find me. That last part hurt more than I wanted to admit. David Brennan, or David Morrison, or whatever name he'd chosen, had built a new life, but he'd left his son behind. He'd left me behind. Even if he'd had reasons, even if he'd been scared or ashamed or convinced that I was better off without him, he'd still made that choice. He'd still walked away. And now I was supposed to care about his story, his legacy, his deathbed confession? Yes, whispered a voice in my head, because it's not just a story. It's yours. Harold picked me up on Thursday morning. He drove an old Buick that smelled like cigarettes and pine air freshener. We didn't talk much on the drive up. What was there to say? We were two men bound by loss and possibility, heading toward a truth that might break both of us. The lawyer's office was in downtown Boston, in one of those old buildings with marble floors and brass fixtures. His name was Simon Chun, and he was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-30s. With a kind of efficient manner that suggested he had 3 other meetings scheduled that afternoon. He verified our identities, had us sign some papers, and then handed Harold a key. The bank was 2 blocks away. We walked in silence, Harold moving slower now, like the weight of what we were about to discover was becoming physical. The safety deposit box was larger than I'd expected. When the bank employee left us alone in the small private room, Harold opened it with shaking hands. Inside were papers. Photos, a thick envelope with my son written on it in fading ink, and a smaller envelope addressed to Harold. Harold picked up his letter first. His hands were trembling so badly he could barely open it. I watched as he read, watched his face crumple, watched tears stream down his weathered cheeks. When he finished, he handed it to me without a word. David's letter to his father was an apology. A long, detailed, heartbroken apology for running away, for letting fear make him a coward, for robbing Harold of 47 years with his son. He explained the embezzlement, the panic, the shame that had made him think death would be better than dishonor. He explained how he'd created David Morrison, how he'd met Catherine, how they'd had a son they'd named Matthew, not Robert Matthew, and how he'd loved that boy more than life itself. When Catherine had died, David had fallen apart. He was working cash jobs under a false name, living in a tiny apartment, barely keeping it together. He'd tried to be a father, but he was drowning. When child services had gotten involved, when they'd said Matthew would be better off in foster care, David had made another cowardly choice. He'd let them take his son. He'd let them place him with a good family who could give him stability and love, and all the things David had failed to provide. He'd told himself it was for the best. That Matthew would be better off not knowing his father was a coward and a criminal, that the boy would have a better life as someone else's son. And then he'd spent the rest of his life trying not to think about it, trying not to wonder, trying not to acknowledge that he'd abandoned the 2 people who'd loved him most in the world. I set the letter down carefully. My hands weren't shaking. I was beyond shaking. I was numb. There was more in the box. Photos of a small boy with dark hair. Me, Matthew. Photos I had no memory of, moments that had been erased from my mind by time and trauma and the desire to forget. There was my original birth certificate, the real one, listing both parents, Catherine and Brennan and David James Brennan, despite what my official record said. There were hospital records from when I was born, school papers from kindergarten with Matthew Brennan written at the top in a child handwriting. And there was the letter for me, for Matthew, for whoever I was now. I couldn't read it there. Couldn't open it with Harold watching, with the weight of the bank and the city and 43 years of lies pressing down on me. I took it, thanked Harold, and told him I needed time. He understood. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he was disappointed that I didn't break down, didn't embrace him as my grandfather, didn't immediately accept this new identity that had been thrust upon me. But I couldn't. Not yet. Because the thing about having your identity shattered is that you can't just pick up the pieces and reassemble them into a new picture. Some of those pieces are lost forever. Some of them have been warped and changed by time. And some of them never fit together in the first place. I was Robert Hensley. I was also Matthew Brennan. I was a man who'd lost everything yesterday and discovered I'd never really had it to begin with. I was a father whose kids were living with their mother in an apartment I'd never seen. I was a son whose father had died 6 months ago without ever trying to make things right. I was all of it and none of it, and I had no idea how to move forward. I didn't open the letter for 3 days. It sat on my kitchen counter in its yellowed envelope, David's handwriting across the front, and I circled it like it was something dangerous, something that might explode if I got too close. Because, in a way, that's exactly what it was. A bomb that could blow up whatever remained of my understanding of who I was. Those 3 days were the longest of my life. Longer than the day I lost everything. Longer than the sleepless night after meeting Harold. Longer than any crisis I'd faced in my 18 years at a job that no longer existed. I tried to do normal things. I sent out resumes, though my heart wasn't in it. I cleaned the house, scrubbing floors and organizing closets, anything to keep my hands busy. I called Sarah twice, but she didn't answer. The second time, I left a voicemail asking if I could see the kids. She texted back, "Not yet. They need time." Time. Everyone needed time. But time for what? To accept? To forget? To figure out how to keep living when everything you thought you knew had turned out to be wrong? On the third night, I poured myself a glass of whiskey, something I rarely did, but normal rules didn't seem to apply anymore, and I opened the letter. David's handwriting was shaky, the writing of a man who knew he was dying. The letter was dated January that year, about 5 months before his death. Dear Matthew, it began, and just seeing that name, my name, the one I'd forgotten I ever had, made my throat tight. I don't know if you'll ever read this. I hope you will. I hope that means you've lived a good life, a better life than I could have given you, and that you're curious enough about where you came from to seek out the answers. But I also hope you've been happy enough that these answers don't matter too much. That's all I ever wanted for you. Happiness. Peace. The things I couldn't seem to find for myself. I need to start by telling you that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for leaving your mother. I'm sorry for leaving you. I'm sorry for being weak when you needed me to be strong. I've spent 45 years being sorry, and it hasn't changed anything. But I need you to know that not a single day has passed when I haven't thought about you. Not one day when I haven't wondered what kind of man you became. Your mother, Catherine, was the best person I ever knew. I met her in Boston when I was trying to build my new life, trying to be David Morrison instead of David Brennan. She knew I was running from something. I never told her what, but she knew, and she loved me anyway. When we found out she was pregnant with you, I was terrified. Terrified that my past would catch up with us, that I'd ruin another life the way I'd ruined everything else. But Catherine wasn't afraid. She said we'd figure out together. She said love was enough. And for a while it was... You were born on a February morning, and I'd never seen anything as perfect as you. Tiny and red-faced and screaming, but perfect. Catherine named you Matthew because it meant gift from God, and that's what you were. A gift I didn't deserve but received anyway. We had 6 years. 6 years of being a family in our tiny apartment. I worked construction jobs, always cash, always under my fake name. Catherine worked as a waitress. We didn't have much, but we had each other. You were smart, Matthew. So smart. You asked a million questions about everything. Why is the sky blue? Where do birds go at night? What makes the rain? And I didn't always know the answers, but I loved that you asked. When Catherine died in that accident, I fell apart. I've been holding my life together with rubber bands and spit, and when she was gone, it all collapsed. I couldn't work, couldn't pay rent, could barely get out of bed. And you, my sweet boy, you were trying so hard to be good, trying to take care of yourself because you knew Daddy wasn't okay. That's the part one can't forgive myself for. You were 6 years old, and you were Theon trying to hold things together. You'd bring me cereal in the morning before school. You'd remind me to pay the bills. You'd wake me up when I'd fallen asleep on the couch again. A 6-year-old child shouldn't have to do that. A 6-year-old should be worried about toy trucks and cartoons, not whether his father is going to remember to buy groceries. When social services got involved, when they said you needed stability and structure and all the things I couldn't provide, I told myself I was doing the right thing by letting you go. I told myself you'd be better off with a real family, people who could give you a normal life, people who weren't hiding from their past, people who weren't broken. I told myself that every day for the rest of my life. I'm not sure I ever believed it. After you were placed at the Hensleys, I kept tabs on you for a while. I shouldn't have, but I did. I drove by their house a few times, saw you play in the yard. You looked happy, healthy. They were good people, and they loved you. That's what I told myself, that you were better off, that I'd done the right thing by staying away. But here's what I've learned in the years since. There is no right thing when you abandon your child. There's just a choice you make and a lifetime of living with it. I chose to let you go. I chose my shame over your right to know your father. I chose to protect myself from the pain of my past instead of fighting for our future. And now I'm dying and I can't fix it. I can't go back and make different choices. I can't be the father you deserved. All I can do is tell you the truth and hope that somewhere in this mess of story, you find something that helps you understand. Not forgive. I don't deserve forgiveness, but understand. Your grandfather, Harold, is a good man, the best man I've ever known. When I ran away all those years ago, I broke his heart. I took away his son and his grandson, and I did it because I was scared. I've thought about reaching out to him 1,000 times, picking up the phone, writing a letter, driving back to Connecticut and knocking on his door. But I never did, because what do you say to someone you've hurt that badly? How do you apologize for stealing decades? I'm leaving instructions with my lawyer to contact him after I'm gone, to give him this address, these documents, the truth I should have given him 47 years ago. If you're reading this, then maybe you've met him. I hope you have. I hope he's still alive, still strong, still the man who taught me how to ride a bike and throw a baseball and stand up for what's right, all the lessons I failed to learn. There's money in an account I've set up for you. Not a fortune, but enough to help if you need it. It's the least I can do, the very least, after everything I took from you. I want you to know something else, Matthew. Something I need you to hear. None of this was your fault. Not Catherine's death. Not my collapse. Not the fact that I let you go. You were a child. You were innocent. You were perfect. And if your life has been hard, if you've struggled, if you felt like something was missing, that's on me, not you. Never you. I hope you had a good life. I hope the Hensleys gave you everything I couldn't. I hope you found love and purpose and peace. I hope you've been happy. But if you haven't, if you felt lost or broken or like you don't quite belong, I want you to know that's my legacy, not yours. You get to choose who you are. You get to decide what kind of man you want to be. You're not bound by my mistakes or my cowardice. You're free. I wish I could have told you this in person. I wish I could have been brave enough to find you while I was still alive, to look you in the eyes and say I'm sorry. But I'm not that brave. I never was. So instead, I'm leaving you this letter and hoping it's enough. Know that you were loved, Matthew. Know that your mother loved you with everything she had. Know that I loved you, even though I showed it in the worst possible way. Know that somewhere in this world there's an old man, your grandfather, who would give anything to meet you. And know that you are not your father's son in the ways that matter. You're better. You have to be. With love and regret. David James Brennan. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it carefully, put it back in its envelope, and set it on the counter. Then I walked out to my back deck and stared at the stars and tried not to scream. You want to know the worst part? The part that made me want to break something? It wasn't the abandonment. It wasn't even the lies or the decades of not knowing. It was the fact that David thought love was enough of an excuse. That he thought saying, I loved you, made up for choosing not to fight. That he thought his pain justified leaving a 6-year-old boy alone. Because I knew that pain. I'd felt it when Sarah left with the kids. When Emma and Jacob had packed their bags and walked out the door, I'd want to collapse too. I'd want to give up and let someone else be their father. Someone who could give them stability and certainty and all the things I suddenly couldn't provide. But I hadn't done that. I'd made the calls. I'd found a lawyer. I'd started figuring out how to see my kids, how to rebuild, how to prove to them and to Sarah and to myself that I was still their father, still someone they could count on. David had chosen differently, and that choice had rippled through decades, affecting people he'd never meet, destroying futures he'd never see. I called Harold the next morning, told him I'd read the letter, told him I needed time to process everything. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that surprised me. You're angry. That's good. That's healthy. Your father made terrible choices, and you have every right to be furious with him. But don't let that anger poison the rest of your life. Son, don't let it make you hard. Son, he called me son, not Matthew, not Robert, just son, and something in me cracked. Over the next week, Harold and I talked every day. Long conversations where he told me about David before everything went wrong, about the boy who'd been curious and kind and full of potential, about the family I'd never known, about the history that was mine by blood even if it had been stolen by circumstance. He told me about his wife, Eleanor, my grandmother, who died 5 years ago never knowing what happened to her son, about how they'd kept David's room exactly as he'd left it for 2 decades before finally packing it away, about the hole that had never closed, the wound that had never healed. And slowly, piece by piece, I started to understand. Not to forgive. I wasn't ready for that, but to understand. David had been young and stupid and scared. He'd made catastrophic choices that had hurt everyone who loved him, but he'd also been human, flawed and broken and trying to survive the only way he knew how, just like me. Because here's what I realized as I talked to Harold. As I learned about the man I'd come from, I was making my own choices right now. In the wake of losing everything, I could choose to collapse like David had. I could choose to run from my responsibilities, to tell myself that Emma and Jacob were better off without me. I could choose to let shame and fear dictate my future. Or I could choose differently. I could choose to fight, to rebuild, to prove that the cycle could be broken, that I didn't have to repeat my father's mistakes just because they were written into my DNA. I called Sarah. This time, I didn't leave a message when she didn't answer. I kept calling until she picked up, and when she did, I didn't make excuses or beg. I just told her the truth. I told her about Harold and David in the letter and everything I'd learned. I told her that I understood she was done with our marriage, that I wasn't going to fight her on the divorce. But I needed to see the kids. I needed to be their father, even if I couldn't be her husband anymore. There was a long silence. Then she said something I didn't expect. You sound different. Different. Maybe I was. Maybe having your identity shattered and rebuilt in the span of 2 weeks changes you. Maybe learning that you're capable of surviving the unsurvivable makes you stronger. Maybe discovering that your father was a coward makes you determined not to be one. We made arrangements. I could see Emma and Jacob the following weekend. It wasn't everything, but it was something, a starting point, a chance to prove that I was still here, still fighting, still their dad. And for the first time since that Tuesday morning when my world fell apart, I felt something other than despair. I felt purpose. If you're still watching this, If you've made it this far with me, then you know what I'm talking about. That moment when you realize you have a choice. When you realize that rock bottom is actually solid ground, and you can either stay there or start climbing. Drop a comment and tell me about your moment. Tell me about the time you chose to fight instead of giving up, because we all need to know we're not alone in this. The first time I saw Emma and Jacob after everything fell apart, I almost broke down right there in Sarah's apartment parking lot. They came out together, Emma walking a little ahead like she always did, Jacob trailing behind with his hands in his pockets. They both looked uncertain, like they weren't sure what to expect from me, like I was a stranger instead of their father. And maybe I was, in a way. The man who'd left for work 2 weeks ago no longer existed. That man had a job and a marriage and a clear identity. This man, the one standing in the parking lot with a duffel bag full of games and snacks and desperate hopes, was someone new, someone who'd been broken down and was trying to figure out how to rebuild. I'd planned what I was going to say. I'd practiced it in the mirror that morning. But when I saw their faces, all those careful words disappeared. I just opened my arms, and after a heartbeat of hesitation, Jacob ran to me, just ran, like he was 7 instead of 12, and crashed into me with enough force to make me stumble. Emma hung back, but I could see the emotion in her eyes. She was trying to be strong, trying to be the mature one, but she was 15 and hurting and confused, and eventually she came to. The three of us stood there in that parking lot, holding on to each other, and I let myself cry, really cry, not the silent tears I've been shedding for weeks, but full, body-shaking sobs. I'm sorry, I told them. I'm so sorry for everything. And I know things are going to be different now, but I need you to know something. I'm still your dad. I'm still here, and I'm going to keep showing up no matter what. We went to the park, the one they used to play at when they were little. It felt strange being there on a weekday afternoon. Strange not having work to rush back to. Strange being just the three of us instead of complete family. But it was also good. We talked, really talked, in a way we hadn't in years. They asked about my job. I was honest with them. I told them I'd been let go, that I was looking for new work, that things were going to be tight financially for a while. Emma asked if that was why Mom had left, and I had to be careful with my answer. I told them their mother and I had been struggling for a long time, that the job loss had just brought things to a head, that sometimes adults fall out of love even when they're trying their hardest, that it wasn't their fault, and it wasn't really anyone's fault. Sometimes things just break. Then Jacob asked the question I'd been dreading. "Are you okay, Dad?" And I realized I had a choice. I could lie, tell them I was fine, put on the brave face. Or I could be honest in a way David had never been with me. "No," I said, "I'm not okay. I'm scared and lost and trying to figure out who I am now that everything's changed. But I'm working on it. And I'm going to be okay eventually. We're all going to be okay." Emma, my brilliant, perceptive daughter, studied me for a long moment. Then she said, "Something else happened, didn't it? Something besides a job and Mom." So I told them, not everything. They didn't need to know all the painful details, but the basics. I told them about Harold, about discovering that their grandfather hadn't died before they were born, like I'd always assumed, about learning that I'd had a different name, a different history, a whole family I'd never known existed. I watched their faces as they processed this information. Shock, confusion, then something that looked like wonder. "So we have a great-grandfather?" Jacob asked, "Like an actual living great-grandfather?" "You do," I said, "and he very much wants to meet you, if that's something you'd be interested in." They were interested. Of course they were interested. Kids crave connections, roots, stories. They want to know everything about Harold, about David, about the history that was theirs by blood, even if they'd never known existed. And that's when I understood something crucial. This wasn't just my story to navigate. It was theirs too. They deserved to know where they came from, who they were connected to, all the messy, complicated truth of it. I arranged for them to meet Harold the following week. I was nervous. What if they didn't connect? What if Harold's grief made things awkward? What if this was a mistake? But I shouldn't have worried. Harold was wonderful with them, patient and kind, and so obviously thrilled to meet them that it made my chest ache. He showed them photos of David as a child, told them stories about their great-grandmother Eleanor, gave them the kind of family history I'd never been able to provide, and I saw my children transform before my eyes. Saw them claim this new piece of their identity, weave it into their understanding of themselves. On the drive back to Sarah's apartment, Emma said something that stayed with me. "Dad, I know everything's really hard right now, but I think maybe it's also kind of like a gift. Like, we get to know more about who we are. We get to have more family. And you get to figure out who you want to be instead of just being who you thought you were supposed to be." 15 years old, and she understood what had taken me weeks to grasp. That sometimes things have to break completely before they can be rebuilt into something better. The next few months were hard. I'm not going to pretend they weren't. Job hunting in your mid-40s after being let go is brutal. The divorce proceedings were emotionally exhausting. There were days I wanted to give up. Days I understood exactly why David had chosen to run instead of fight. But I kept showing up. For the kids. For Harold, who became a lifeline in ways I hadn't expected. For myself. I found work eventually, not in corporate project management, but in construction management. Something about the symmetry appealed to me, following in David's footsteps, but doing it better, doing it right. The pay was less, the hours were longer, but the work felt honest in a way my old job never had. Sarah and I finalized the divorce in February. It was sad but not bitter. We both moved on, both accepted that we'd been holding on to something that had died years ago. She'd started dating someone from the hospital, and I was happy for her. Really happy, not the fake happiness you force when you're trying to be mature. She deserved to be with someone who could give her what she needed. The kids adjusted. They spent weekdays with Sarah and weekends with me. It wasn't a life I'd imagined for them, but it was a life, and in some ways it was better. I was present now in a way I'd never been when I was working 60-hour weeks and sleepwalking through my marriage. Every moment with Emma and Jacob became precious because I knew how easily it could be taken away. Harold became a fixture in our lives. He taught Jacob how to fish. He helped Emma with a history project about family genealogy that turned into an A-plus paper and a deeper understanding of resilience and survival. He gave me something I'd needed without knowing it, a connection to the past that wasn't built on lies. I kept David's letter. Read it sometimes when I needed to remember that choices matter, that the easy path isn't always the right path, that being a father means showing up especially when it's hard. And slowly, month by month, I rebuilt my life. Not into what it had been before. That was gone, and trying to recreate it would have been foolish, but into something new, something that fit better, even if it looked nothing like what I'd planned. I met someone eventually, Rachel, a teacher who'd been through her own divorce, and understood that broken people could build something beautiful together. She had a daughter, Lily, who got along well with Emma and Jacob. We took things slow, both of us scared of making the same mistakes twice. But there was something there, something real and honest and worth exploring. On the 1-year anniversary of the day everything fell apart, I drove back to Murphy's Diner, sat in the same booth where Harold had found me, ordered the same cheeseburger I'd been too numb to eat. Diane was still working there. She remembered me, though she didn't know the whole story, just that I'd been there on a bad night and had left with an old man who'd seemed to know me. "You look better," she said, pouring my coffee. "Whatever was weighing on you that night, looks like you figured it out." I thought about that, about whether I'd figured anything out or just learned to live with uncertainty, about whether the man sitting in that booth now was Robert or Matthew or some hybrid of both, about whether David's choices had defined me or freed me. "I'm working on it," I told her, and it was true. I was still working on it, still figuring out who I was supposed to be, still learning from the past while refusing to be imprisoned by it. The thing about having your life fall apart is that it gives you a choice. You can let it destroy you, can follow in the footsteps of people like David who ran from their pain and spent the rest of their lives hiding. Or you can stand in the rubble and start rebuilding, piece by piece, day by day, choosing with every breath to be better than your worst moment. I chose to rebuild. And yeah, the new structure looks different from what I'd had before. The foundation is in a different place. Some of the materials are repurposed from the old life. Some are brand new, but it's mine, built on truth instead of assumptions, on choice instead of obligation, on love that's been tested and survived. Emma graduates next year. She's applying to colleges, talking about studying psychology, wants to help people who are struggling with identity and loss. I see echoes of what I went through in her passion, and I'm proud of that. Proud that she took pain and transformed it into purpose. Jacob's doing well, too. He's on the baseball team. Harold never misses a game, and he's talking about wanting to learn construction, maybe work with me during summers. The kid who was 12 when his world fell apart is becoming a young man who understands that everything can change in a day, and that survival is a skill worth having. Harold is 83 now, still sharp, still engaged, still grateful every day that he got to meet his grandson and great-grandchildren before it was too late. He tells them stories about David that I could never tell, stories about the man before the mistakes, before the fear, before the running, and those stories matter. They give us context, help us understand that people are more than their worst choices. I think about David sometimes, about the letter, about the life he built in hiding, about the regrets that must have eaten at him for 47 years. And I've learned something. Forgiveness isn't always about the person who hurt you. Sometimes it's about releasing yourself from the weight of their choices. I've forgiven David, not because he deserved it, but because carrying that anger was making me into someone I didn't want to be. The money he left has helped. It paid for counseling the kids, helped with the divorce expenses, gave me breathing room while I was getting back on my feet. It wasn't atonement. Nothing could atone for leaving a 6-year-old boy. But it was something, an acknowledgement that he'd tried, even if too late and in the wrong way. I've been back to his grave once. David Morrison. The headstone says, no mention the name he was born with. I stood there and told him about Emma and Jacob, about Harold, about the life I was building. I told him I wished he'd been braver. I told him I understood why he wasn't. And then I walked away, leaving the past in the ground where it belonged. Because that's the thing about rock bottom, about losing everything in a single day, about having your identity shattered and rebuilt. It teaches you that you're stronger than you thought, that you can survive the unsurvivable, that the person you become after everything falls apart can be better, more authentic, more alive than the person you were before. I'm not glad it happened. I wouldn't wish that kind of pain on anyone, but I'm not sorry it happened either, because it forced me to choose, to decide what kind of man I wanted to be, what kind of father, what kind of person. And I chose to be someone who shows up, someone who fights, someone who breaks the cycle. That night in the diner, when Harold sat down across from me and said I looked like his son, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered, and discovered that even my identity was a lie. I was wrong. I hadn't lost everything. I'd lost the things that were already broken, the structures that were built on faulty foundations. And yeah, my identity was more complicated than I'd known, but that didn't make it a lie. It made it richer, deeper, more interesting. Robert Hensley was the boy the Hensleys raised, the man who built a career and a family. Matthew Brennan was a child of David and Catherine, the grandson of Harold and Eleanor, and the person I am now is both of those and neither of them. I'm the sum of my choices, not my circumstances. I'm the father who chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. I'm the man who looked at his broken life and decided to build something new. If you're watching this and you're going through your own collapse, your own moment of losing everything, I want you to know something. You'll survive this. It doesn't feel like it right now. It feels like the end, but it's not the end. It's the middle, the hard part, the part where you're in the ruins trying to figure out what to salvage and what to let go. And you will figure it out. Maybe not today, maybe not for months, but you will, because humans are resilient in ways we don't appreciate until we're tested. We bend and break and somehow keep going. We find strength in places we didn't know we had. We discover that rock bottom is actually solid ground, and from there, the only direction is up. So keep going, keep showing up, keep choosing to be better than your worst moment. Keep building, even when it feels pointless. Because one day, you'll look around and realize that the life you built from the ashes is actually pretty damn good. Different for what you planned, but maybe better precisely because you chose instead of falling into it. That's my story. That's what I learned the night my world fell apart, and an elderly stranger sat down next to me and changed everything. That loss can be the beginning of something instead of just an ending. That family is more than biology, but biology matters too. That identity is something you claim rather than something you're given. That showing up is the most important thing you can do. And that sometimes the worst day of your life is also the first day of something better. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. If this story meant something to you, do me one last favor. Check the description box below for more stories like this. Real stories about real people surviving real pain and coming out the other side. Because we all need to know we're not alone. We all need to know that survival is possible. We all need to know that we're stronger than we think.